So there's now another layer in the Jim Knowles to Penn State saga that I don't 100% know that I believe. If you haven't been following along, Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles is leaving to go to Penn State for the same job, except he's going to make roughly $1 million more per year, which is not an inconsequential amount of money, by the way. I don't want to pretend as if I'm poo pooing $1 million a year. That's still a lot of money. And if you want to know my feelings on the idea of what that means for Penn State and Ohio State, you can check out yesterday's episode of the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, or also on YouTube. And I look forward to having that conversation with you. But there's another wrinkle to this. The news came out on Sunday, just after Ohio State celebrated its national championship at its stadium in front of its fans. And Jim Knowles was not at that celebration, and people noticed, began to wonder, and then the news came out that he was leaving for one of Ohio State's biggest rivals. And so there was a lot of pushback, there was a lot of negativity surrounding that idea that Jim Knowles was not there. Now, I'm not going to get into the salacious stuff that Jim Knowles and Ryan Day hated each other, and he felt I'm not going to get into that because I don't think that has like I have no way of knowing that. I can speculate on that, and believe me, part of the fun of doing this is speculation. But I don't, I don't necessarily get my rocks off when it comes to like they hate each other or like anything that might have to do with real life. Now it's fun to speculate about like, hey, this might have happened and this is why they called that on third down. When you start talking about like people's personal and professional lives, like I don't do fire the coach radio. I don't do well, what I heard was it just is not my bag. So if you want to do that, if you want to sit in the comments and say Larry Johnson and Jim Knowles hated each other, and Jim Knowles then turned to you have at it. That's just not something I'm really all that interested in doing because I just generally, and you might come to disagree with this, I don't like to just sit here and make an ass out of myself. So I'm not going to start today. Now, you could probably argue that I've been doing it for a while, but that's neither here nor there. There was a tweet that went somewhat viral on Monday morning from Brett McMurphy, a college football reporter for the Action Network. And it says Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles was asked by the school not to attend the Buckeyes national championship celebration while he deliberated his options, a source said. Knowles' representation tried to reach a deal with Ohio State week before the title game and immediately after, but eventual offer was well below the competition. Knowles signed a 3-year a $9.3 million deal with Penn State on Sunday. So anytime you get in a situation like this, where sources say, and by the way, I think so. I do media work outside of this podcast where I deal with agents, which probably tips my hand of who I think released this. Um, and anytime you're fed information, you have to ask yourself, who does this benefit? And sometimes that doesn't matter, right? Like sometimes it's just like whoop de doo. I don't care who who benefits from this information being out there. It's pertinent information. It's interesting information. I'm going to get it out there. So I don't blame Brett McMurphy for tweeting this. I don't think he's in the wrong for saying this is what happened from according to who I spoke with. But when you get information like this and it's released to the public then the sidebar I was going to say, by the way, is like when somebody says like anonymous sources, they're not getting an email from like x569274325321 at gmail.com. Like they know who is giving them the information, by the way. Like they don't want you to know who's giving them the information. And I think that's important to distinguish because I see a lot of times like, well, they should put their name on it. Who do they don't even know who the anonymous source is? Like, yes, they do. That's anonymous isn't anonymous to them, it's anonymous to you. But when you get information like this, as a consumer of news, information, etc. Ask yourself, okay, who would know this information? Who would know that Jim Knowles was asked not to go to the national championship celebration? That would consist of Ryan Day, the rest of the Ohio State coaching staff, probably Jim Knowles' agent, Jim Knowles' close family and friends, the Ohio State Athletic Department, the Ohio State president. That's about the list. Because by all accounts, the players did not know that Jim Knowles wasn't going to be there. So it wasn't as if Brett McMurphy got a tip from Jack Sawyer that that Jim Knowles wasn't going to be at the celebration. So with that list of people who have that information, if that's true, does it benefit Ryan Day or anybody at Ohio State to release that information? No, because they don't look good now. They look like sour grapes. If you don't want to be with us, if you're going to take your ball and go somewhere else, don't even bother showing up to the celebration that you helped make sure happened. So they don't look good in that. They're not going to release that. So who does look good in this situation? Jim Knowles and Jim Knowles' agent. So there's probably your culprit of who released that information. Then you follow it up with Knowles' representation tried to reach a deal with Ohio State the week before the title game and immediately after, but the eventual offer was well below the competition. Now, the only people who would have that information are the Ohio State athletic director, the Ohio State president, Ryan Day, maybe the other coaches, Jim Knowles, and Jim Knowles' agent. Doesn't benefit Ohio State for that information to get out because they look dumb that they didn't work as hard as possible to retain their defensive coordinator who helped them win a national championship. It makes them look cheap. It makes them look weak on the college football stage. So they're not going to release that information. So who would do that? Jim Knowles or Jim Knowles' agent. Now, why would they do such a thing? Why would Jim Knowles or Jim Knowles' agent release information that Ohio State was well below the competition for his services? And why would Jim Knowles or Jim Knowles' agent share that he was not invited to the national championship celebration? Because it saves Jim Knowles or Jim Knowles' agent ass. Because when you are having a rough one in the PR world, and I would say Jim Knowles was having a rough one, that the day your team is celebrating its national championship, you're nowhere to be found and you took a more lucrative offer elsewhere. It's a really quick and easy way to find yourself at the ire of a fan base. You know how you get out of that? You start sharing your side of the story. Because if you're not telling your side of the story, somebody else is. And the chances that somebody else is telling your story the way you want it told and the most accurate representation from your perspective is not high. So, how do you make sure that your side of the story gets told? You tell your side of the story. So, I'll let you put two and two together of who is the likely source to Brett McMurphy's report. I don't think it's going to take many lines drawn to connect those dots. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.